Mark had spent 20 years of his life serving in the military. He was a staff sergeant, a man who took pride in his duty and loved his country deeply. He was also a man who loved his wife, Elena. They had built a life together, or so Mark thought, and they had 2 wonderful children. Mark wasn't just a soldier, he was a father and a husband. He believed that after 2 decades of service, he was finally nearing the finish line. He had one last deployment overseas, and then he planned to retire. He dreamed of coming home for good, fixing up the old house, and spending his days coaching his son's soccer team and taking his daughter to school. He thought Elena wanted the same thing. The weeks leading up to his departure were busy, as they always were. There were uniforms to press, gear to pack, and endless paperwork to sign. But amidst the chaos, Mark felt a strange coldness coming from Elena. It wasn't like her to be distant, especially when he was about to leave for a dangerous area. Usually, she would be clingy, maybe a bit teary, making him promise to call every chance he got. This time, however, she was always on her phone. Whenever Mark walked into the room, she would quickly put it face down or change the subject. When he asked her if everything was okay, she would give him a tight smile and say she was just tired. Mark wanted to push, to ask what was really going on, but the stress of the deployment was heavy. He told himself she was just worried about him being gone for so long. He didn't want to leave on a bad note, so he let it slide, convincing himself it was nothing. The day Mark finally left was emotional, but mostly for him. He hugged his children tight, feeling a pang of guilt in his chest for leaving them again. He turned to Elena for a goodbye kiss, expecting a hug. Instead, she gave him a quick peck on the cheek and a stiff pat on the back. "Be safe, Mark," she said, her voice flat. "Call when you can." She didn't even look him in the eye. As Mark drove away, watching the house disappear in the rearview mirror, he felt a pit of dread in his stomach that had nothing to do with the war zone he was heading to. He felt like he was leaving his life behind, not just for a year, but maybe forever. The first month in the desert was grueling. The heat was unbearable, and the work was endless. Mark tried to call home every chance he got, but the time difference made it difficult. When he did get through, the conversations were short and awkward. Elena always had an excuse to get off the phone. The kids were busy, or she was in the middle of something important. She never asked how he was doing. She never told him she missed him. Mark started to feel isolated. He was thousands of miles from home, living in a tent, and the one person who was supposed to be his anchor was drifting away. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. Mark was in the command center, working on a logistics report, when a young soldier walked in holding a sealed envelope. "Sergeant Mark," the soldier asked. "You have some legal documents that came through the JAG office." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Legal documents? He hadn't done anything wrong. He took the envelope, his hands shaking slightly, and walked outside to the dust and heat to open it. He expected maybe a notification about a change in his will or some paperwork regarding his pay. What he found made his blood run cold. It was a petition for divorce. Elena was filing to end their marriage. And she wasn't just asking for a divorce, she was asking for everything. She wanted full custody of the kids. She wanted the house. She wanted the car. She wanted half of his pension, the pension he had spent 20 years bleeding for. And the reason listed on the paper: irreconcilable differences. Mark sank down onto a crate, the paper crinkling in his grip. He felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Divorce while he was deployed, it was the lowest blow possible. She knew he couldn't come home to fight it. She knew he was stuck in a war zone with limited legal resources. She was using his absence against him, banking on him being too distracted or too far away to stop her. But the shock of the divorce papers was quickly replaced by a much more alarming discovery. Mark tried to log into his bank account to send some money home for the kids, as he usually did. The screen flashed an error message, access denied. He tried again, thinking it was a bad internet connection. Same error. He called the bank's customer service line, enduring the hold music and the static of the overseas connection. When a representative finally answered, the news was devastating. "I'm sorry, sir," the agent said, "but your joint accounts have been frozen due to a pending legal dispute. And it appears your wife has opened a new individual account and transferred the available funds." Mark couldn't believe his ears. She hadn't just filed for divorce, she had cleaned him out. She had taken every penny they had, leaving him with nothing while he was stuck in the middle of the desert. Panic started to set in. How was he supposed to pay for anything? How was he supposed to support his kids? He felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He was a soldier, a man trained to handle impossible situations, but this was different. This was his life being dismantled piece by the woman he loved. He spent the next few days in a fog. He couldn't focus on his work. His commanding officer noticed the change in him and pulled him aside. Mark explained the situation, his voice tight with anger and confusion. The officer was sympathetic but realistic. "You need to get stateside, Sergeant," he said. "You can't fight a custody battle and a financial war from a satellite phone. I'll see what I can do about emergency leave." It took 2 weeks of pleading and paperwork, but finally, Mark got the news. He was being sent home on emergency leave for 30 days. It wasn't much time, but it was something. The flight back was the longest 20 hours of his life. His mind was racing with scenarios. He would beg her to reconsider, for the kids' sake. He would tell her they could go to counseling. Surely, this was just a moment of weakness on her part. Surely, she missed him as much as he missed her. When the plane finally touched down on U.S. soil, Mark felt a mix of relief and dread. He rented a car and drove straight to their house, his heart pounding in his chest. It was late at night, and all the lights in the house were off. He expected to find Elena sleeping, or maybe waiting up for him. He expected a warm reunion, or at least a sad one. He expected to see his wife. Instead, as he pulled into the driveway, his headlights swept across the front of the house. It looked different. The garden was overgrown, the weeds choking the flowers Elena used to tend so carefully. But the most shocking thing was parked in the driveway. It wasn't his old pickup truck. It was a brand new, luxury SUV. It was sleek, shiny, and expensive. The kind of car that cost more than Mark made in a year. Mark stared at the car, confusion clouding his mind. Where did this come from? How did she afford this? She had drained their savings, sure, but there wasn't enough money in there to buy a car like that outright. A cold suspicion began to creep into his mind, pushing aside his hopes of a simple reconciliation. He quietly got out of his rental car and walked to the front door, reaching for his keys. The key didn't fit. He tried again, jiggling the handle. The lock had been changed. Mark stood on the porch, the man who owned this house, the man who paid the mortgage, locked out in the cold. He knocked on the door, first gently, then louder. "Elena!" he called out. "Elena, open the door. It's Mark." He waited. Minutes passed. Finally, The porch light flicked on, blinding him for a second. The door opened, but it wasn't swung open wide. It was cracked just a few inches, held by the security chain. Elena's face appeared in the gap. She wasn't crying. She wasn't happy to see him. She looked annoyed. "What are you doing here, Mark?" she asked, her voice cold. "I live here," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "What is going on? Why is there a new car in the driveway? Why did you change the locks?" Elena stared at him for a moment, and then a small smile played on her lips. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who thinks they have already won. "I told you, Mark. It's over. I filed the papers. The house is mine until the court says otherwise." "You took all the money," Mark said, gripping the door frame. "You left me with nothing over there. How could you do that?" "I did what I had to do to protect myself and the kids," she said, her voice hardening. "You're gone all the time, Mark. I needed security. Now, you need to leave. You can't just barge in here." Mark stepped back, stunned by her cruelty. "I just got back from a war zone, Elena. I haven't even seen my kids yet. Are you going to let me see them?" "They're sleeping," she said flatly. "And you're not welcome here tonight. You have a place on base, don't you go there." With that, she slammed the door shut. Mark stood alone in the dark, the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place echoing in the quiet night. He looked at the expensive car, then at the dark windows of the house he had worked for 2 decades to provide. The man who had faced enemy fire felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the night air. His wife hadn't just left him, she had set a trap. And as he walked back to his rental car, he realized that the battle for his life was just beginning, and this time, the enemy wasn't hiding in the mountains overseas. The enemy was living in his house, sleeping in his bed, and driving a car he couldn't afford. Mark drove off the base, knowing that his happy homecoming was a lie, and that something much darker was lurking behind his wife's sudden desire for a win. Mark drove onto the military base with a heavy feeling in his chest. The familiar sight of the guard gate and the rows of identical beige buildings usually gave him a sense of order and pride. Tonight, however, it just felt like a dead end. He wasn't coming home to a hero's welcome. He was coming back to live in a barracks room like a young private, despite being a staff sergeant with 20 years of service. The base legal office was closed, so he couldn't do anything official until the morning. He spent the night staring at the ceiling of his temporary room, replaying the look on Elena's face over and over in his mind. She hadn't just been angry, she had been smug. That look scared him more than the divorce itself. The next morning, the sun was bright, but Mark's mood was dark. He went straight to the JAG office to see what could be done. The legal officer was a young captain, barely 30 years old, who looked at Mark's file with a frown. "Sir," the officer said, "this is a mess. She's frozen everything, and she's claiming she needs the house for stability because of your deployments. She's even filed a restraining order, citing emotional distress and claiming you might be unstable due to PTSD." Mark slammed his hand on the desk, a little harder than he meant to. "PTSD? I've been screened twice a year for 20 years. I'm fine. She's the one stealing my money." "I believe you, Sergeant," the lawyer said calmly. "But in family court right now, you are a deployed male who just came back. She's playing the sympathy card perfectly. If you go over there and cause a scene, you're proving her point. You can't go near the house right now. You have to follow the rules." Mark felt trapped. He was being painted as the villain in his own life. He was told he would have to wait for a court date, which could be weeks away. He walked out of the office feeling helpless. He decided he needed to see his kids, even if he couldn't go inside the house. He knew their school schedule better than anyone. He drove to the elementary school and parked down the street, watching the front gate. When the bell rang, parents started lining up in their cars. Mark kept his head low. He saw his daughter, Lily, walking out with her little backpack. She looked smaller than he remembered. But she wasn't walking alone. Elena was there, holding her hand. She was also holding the hand of Mark's son, Noah. They walked toward that shiny new SUV Mark had seen the night before. As they got closer, he saw something that made his blood boil. A man was leaning against the SUV. He was dressed in expensive casual clothes, the kind people wear when they don't have to work. He had a smile on his face as he ruffled Noah's hair. Elena laughed at something the man said, a genuine, happy laugh. It was the same laugh she used to give Mark when he came home from a trip, before things went wrong. The man opened the door for her like she was a queen. Elena didn't look sad. She didn't look like a struggling single mother. She looked like she had just won the lottery. Mark gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Who was this guy? How long had he been hanging around his family? And most importantly, how was Elena paying for that car and the clothes she was wearing? Mark had been sending his paycheck directly to their joint account for months. He knew exactly how much was in there before she froze it. There was no way she had enough cash saved up to buy a luxury SUV and support a new lifestyle without touching that money. Unless she had another source of income. He sat in his car, feeling like a spy in his own life. He wanted to jump out and confront them. He wanted to drag that guy away from his kids. But the lawyer's warning echoed in his head, don't prove her point. If he caused a scene at the school, the police would come, and the restraining order would be used against him. He would lose any chance of getting custody. With a heavy heart, Mark started the engine and drove away. He couldn't fight them with his fists, he had to fight them with his brain. Over the next few days, Mark moved like a ghost. He stayed on base, avoiding the places he and Elena used to go. He spent every waking hour gathering documents. He printed his bank statements from the last 6 months. He printed his deployment records. He tried to create a timeline of when things started to go wrong. He remembered the strange phone calls she used to take before he left. He remembered her suddenly being busy with a new group of friends. One evening, Mark was sitting in the base cafeteria, picking at a tray of food, when an old friend sat down across from him. It was Miller, a fellow staff sergeant who had retired the year before. Miller looked at Mark's tired face and asked what was wrong. Mark spilled everything. He told him about the divorce, the locks, the money, and the new guy at the school. Miller listened quietly, sipping his coffee. When Mark was done, Miller didn't offer sympathy. He looked serious. Mark, none of this adds up, Miller said. The car, the confidence, she's acting like she doesn't need your money. But she froze your accounts anyway. Why? Because she's greedy, Mark said. Maybe, Miller said, leaning in closer. Or maybe she's hiding something. You said she froze the accounts right after you deployed. That sounds planned. And if she has a new guy with money, why does she need your pension? Mark hadn't thought about that. It was a good question. If this new guy was so rich, why was Elena fighting so hard for Mark's military pension and the child support? She should be trying to cut ties completely. Unless the new guy wasn't who he seemed. I need to find out who that guy is, Mark said. You can't do that yourself, Miller warned. You'll get arrested. But you know who can, a private investigator. Or better yet, a forensic accountant. Someone who knows how to follow the money. Mark nodded. He didn't have much savings left since Elena had taken most of it, but he had a little bit set aside for his retirement that was in a separate account she didn't know about. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to hire someone. The next day, Mark went to the town off base, a place he used to shop at with his family. He found a small office building with a sign that said investigations and legal support. The man he met was named Mr. Henderson. He was an older guy, a former police officer with gray hair and sharp eyes. Mark laid out his story. He didn't hold anything back. He told Henderson about the luxury car, the timing of the divorce, and the frozen assets. Henderson looked at the photos Mark had managed to take of the SUV and the mysterious man from a distance. This isn't just a divorce case, Sergeant, Henderson said slowly. This smells like fraud. You said she works part-time at a design shop. Yeah, Mark said. She sells candles and crafts. And this guy, Henderson pointed to the photo. Do a reverse image search on this car if you can, but I have a feeling he's not just a boyfriend. I've seen this pattern before. The wife finds a way to make quick money using the husband's absence. It's risky, but if she thinks she's smart enough to get away with it, she'll try. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean make money? How? Using your name, Henderson said. Or your status. Military spouses have access to certain networks. If she's connected to the wrong people, she could be setting up dummy contracts or using your identity to secure loans. Or maybe she's stealing from your benefits. Henderson agreed to take the case. He asked for access to all the old financial records Mark could get his hands on. Over the next week, Mark spent his time at the library, using the computers to print out credit reports and old tax returns. It was tedious work, but it gave him a sense of purpose. He wasn't just sitting around feeling sorry for himself anymore. He was hunting. Meanwhile, the harassment from Elena's lawyer continued. Mark received letters demanding he sign over the house immediately. They threatened to go to his commanding officer if he didn't comply, claiming he was refusing to support his children. It was a dirty tactic. They were trying to scare him into giving up. Mark had to explain the situation to his commander, which was humiliating, but his commander understood. He told Mark to keep his head down and let the legal process work. But Mark knew the legal process was slow. He didn't have time to be slow. A few days later, Henderson called Mark. I found something, the investigator said, his voice tense. I looked into that car. It's leased under a shell company. But guess who the registered contact is for that company? Elena, Mark asked. No, Henderson said. A man named Robert Vance. But here's the kicker, Sergeant. Vance owns a construction supply company. A company that, coincidentally, just won a large subcontracting bid to supply materials for, guess who? Mark held his breath. The base, Henderson said. Your base. Specifically, the renovation projects happening in the housing units where you live. Mark felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Elena wasn't just dating a random rich guy. She was dating a contractor. And not just any contractor, one who was doing business with the military. If Elena had helped him get that contract, or if she was using her position as a sergeant's wife to influence the deal, that was a crime. A serious federal crime. It gets worse, Henderson continued. I traced some of those transfers from your frozen account. They didn't just go to her personal account. They went through a routing number that matches Vance's business deposits before landing in her account. She's washing the money through him, Mark. Or he's paying her off under the table. Mark stood in the parking lot, the phone pressed to his ear. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Elena wasn't just leaving him for another man. She was using him. She had used his deployment to set up this scheme. She probably thought Mark would be too busy or too loyal to suspect his own wife. She probably thought that by the time he came back, the money would be hidden, the contracts would be signed, and she would be long gone. She thinks she's untouchable, Mark whispered. She thinks you're just a dumb soldier who follows orders, Henderson said. But we're going to show her that you don't mess with a man who knows how to fight a war. Mark hung up the phone and looked at the horizon. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the base. The anger he felt before was still there, but it was colder now. It wasn't a hot, blinding rage anymore. It was a calculated, focused determination. Elena beamed when she thought she had won. She smiled at that school because she thought she had pulled off the perfect crime. But she had made one mistake. She had underestimated the man she married. She thought Mark was just a paycheck and a uniform. She forgot that his job was to find the enemy and neutralize them. Now, he knew who the enemy was. He wasn't going to the next court date to beg for mercy. He was going to court to set a trap. And this time, Elena wouldn't see it coming until the handcuffs clicked shut. Mark got back into his car. He wasn't the victim anymore. He was the hunter, and the hunt had just begun. The days following Mark's meeting with the investigator were a blur of activity and caffeine. He moved out of the temporary barracks and into a small, cheap motel room just off base. It wasn't comfortable, but it was private, and it gave him a place to spread out the mountain of paperwork he was accumulating. While Mark was good at leading soldiers and planning missions, diving into financial fraud was a different beast. He felt like he was learning a new language, one of wire transfers, shell companies, and tax evasion. He worked closely with Mr. Henderson. The older investigator was patient, explaining things to Mark in simple terms, treating him like a partner rather than just a client. Together, they built a timeline. It started 6 months ago, right before Mark's deployment orders landed. That was when Elena first met Robert Vance, the contractor with the flashy smile and the new SUV. What they discovered made Mark's stomach churn. It wasn't just that Elena was having an affair. She was actively using Mark's identity to secure her future with this new man. Henderson uncovered credit card applications filled out in Mark's name but sent to a PO box Elena had rented. She had maxed out cards Mark didn't even know existed, using the cash to fund investments in Vance's failing construction business. Vance's company was in trouble. He had big contracts but no cash flow to buy the materials. That's where Elena came in. She used Mark's solid military credit and their savings to float Vance's business, essentially robbing Mark to pay her new boyfriend. They thought they were geniuses. They thought that because Mark was overseas, he wouldn't notice the missing money until it was too late. But the smoking gun, the one thing that made Mark see red, was what they did with his housing allowance. The military gives soldiers a specific amount of money for housing, called BA. It is meant to cover rent or mortgage. Mark had always sent this directly to their joint account, and the bank automatically deducted the mortgage payment. But Elena had contacted the bank and changed the automated payment to manual. She stopped paying the mortgage entirely. For 4 months, she had been pocketing thousands of dollars of Mark's housing allowance, letting the mortgage payments pile up, all while she drove around in a luxury car and pretended to be a successful businesswoman. She's stealing from the government in a way, Henderson explained one evening, pointing to a highlighted spreadsheet. She's using federally funded money meant for housing to fund a private business. And because she's doing it while you're deployed during a national emergency, it falls under very specific fraud laws. Mark sat on the edge of the motel bed, looking at the evidence. He felt betrayed on a level he didn't know existed. It wasn't just about love, it was about respect. She had erased his life, his hard work, and his honor to play house with a con artist. "We have enough for the divorce court," Henderson said, closing the file folder. "We can show the judge she's irresponsible with money. But Mark, if you want to really stop her, if you want to make sure she doesn't get a dime of your pension or custody of those kids, we need to go to the military police. This is a crime." Mark hesitated. Turning his wife into the authorities felt extreme. He remembered how she looked when they got married. He remembered the birth of his children. Did he really want to be the reason she went to prison? He paced the small room, thinking about his kids. He thought about Lily and Noah. If Elena went to jail, the kids would be devastated. But if she won, if she got custody and the money, she would raise them with Vance. She would teach them that lying and stealing was okay. She would drain Mark's pension and leave the kids with nothing when they grew up. "She didn't just cheat on me," Mark said finally, his voice hard. "She endangered my security clearance. She used my name to commit fraud. She stole the roof over my children's heads." "Yeah, Mr. Henderson. Let's take it to the authorities." With that decision, the weight on Mark's shoulders shifted. He wasn't just a victim anymore, he was a witness. He wasn't fighting for his marriage, he was fighting for his life. The next step was to get the military involved. Mark couldn't just walk into the police station, he needed to go through his chain of command. This was the scariest part. Mark had always been a soldier who kept his personal problems private. Having to admit that his wife was a criminal felt like a failure. He put on his dress uniform, making sure every ribbon was straight, and walked into the commander's office. His commander, Colonel Miller, was a stern man who didn't tolerate drama. Mark stood at attention and laid the file on the desk. "Sir, I have a situation regarding my pending divorce that involves potential fraud against the government and the misuse of military funds." Colonel Miller picked up the file, expecting a messy domestic dispute. As he read, his eyes narrowed. He read for 20 minutes without saying a word. The only sound in the room was the clock ticking on the wall. Finally, he looked up. "Sit down, Sergeant," the colonel said. "This is serious. You're saying your wife and this civilian contractor are using your deployment status to siphon funds?" "Yes, sir. And she's lying to the civilian court about my mental state to get custody and my pension, while simultaneously hiding the money she stole." The colonel closed the folder. "I can't get involved in the divorce, Sergeant. That's a civilian matter. But this fraud, the misuse of government funds, that is military business. I'm calling the Criminal Investigation Division SID. They are going to want to talk to you." For the next week, Mark spent his days being interviewed by SID agents. They were tough, professional men and women who didn't care about Mark's feelings, they only cared about the facts. Mark handed over everything: every bank statement, every printed email, every photo Henderson had taken. The agents were impressed by the quality of the evidence. "She's sloppy," one agent told Mark. She thinks because she's a civilian spouse, the military rules don't apply to her. She thinks the divorce court is the only place she has to answer to. She's about to find out the hard way that stealing from a soldier during wartime is a federal offense. While the investigation gathered speed in the background, the date for the divorce hearing arrived. This was the preliminary hearing where the judge would decide temporary custody and who stayed in the house. Elena was confident. She walked into the courthouse wearing a sharp new outfit, looking like she had just stepped out of a fashion magazine. Her lawyer, a shark-like man named Mr. Graves, was already there, whispering in her ear. Mark sat on the other side with his JAG attorney. Mark hadn't slept well the night before. He was nervous. He knew he had the evidence of fraud, but the judge might not care about that today. The judge might just look at the fact that Mark was living in a motel and Elena was in the house. The judge might look at the fact that Mark was unstable according to Elena's claims. The hearing started, and it went exactly as Mark feared. Mr. Graves stood up and painted a terrible picture of Mark. "Your Honor," Graves began, "my client is terrified of the defendant. He is a trained killer suffering from untreated PTSD. He has abandoned his family for years to go to war, and now that he is back, he refuses to leave the marital home peacefully. He has harassed her at the school, and she fears for her safety. She needs full custody and exclusive possession of the home to protect the children." Mark's jaw tightened. He hadn't harassed anyone. He just wanted to see his kids. But when his lawyer stood up to object, the judge cut him off. "I'm looking at the facts," the judge said, looking at Mark over his glasses. "Sergeant, you admit you changed the locks on your wife?" "No, Your Honor, she changed the locks on me," Mark said firmly. "And yet, you showed up at her residence unannounced in the middle of the night." "I came home from a deployment, sir. It's my house." The judge sighed. "Sergeant, until we settle this, tempers are too high. For the safety of the children, I am granting temporary primary residence to the mother. You will have supervised visitation rights only for now. And as for the house, Mrs. Mark retains possession. You are to vacate the premises immediately if you haven't already." It felt like a slap in the face. Elena sat there, trying to suppress a smile. She glanced at Mark, and he could see the triumph in her eyes. She thought she had won. She thought the system worked for her. She had played the victim perfectly, and the judge had bought it. But she didn't know what was happening in the hallway. Just as the judge was banging his gavel, the heavy oak doors to the courtroom swung open. Everyone turned to look. Two uniformed military police officers walked in, followed by a man in a suit holding a badge. It was the lead SID agent. The judge looked up, annoyed by the interruption. "This is a private courtroom," the judge said. "I apologize, Your Honor," the agent said loudly. "But I have a federal subpoena for Mrs. Elena Mark. We need her to step outside for a moment." The room went silent. Elena's smile vanished instantly. Her face turned pale as a sheet. She looked at her lawyer, Mr. Graves, who looked just as confused. "What is this about?" Graves stammered. "It's about fraud, embezzlement, and theft of government funds, sir," the agent said, walking straight to Elena's table. "Mrs. Mark, you need to come with us. Now." Elena stood up, her legs shaking. I don't understand. I'm in the middle of a divorce." "You're done with the divorce for today," the agent said. He took her by the arm, not roughly, but firmly enough that she knew she wasn't going anywhere else. Mark sat still in his chair. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just watched. He watched the realization dawn on her face. She looked at the judge for help, but the judge looked down at his papers, realizing he was out of his depth. This was no longer a simple divorce squabble. This was a criminal investigation. As the agents led Elena out of the room, her head high but her eyes wide with fear, Mark finally felt a sense of peace. He walked out of the courtroom a few minutes later. He found his JAG lawyer waiting in the hall, looking stunned. "Did you know that was going to happen?" the lawyer asked. Mark adjusted his cap. "I knew they were building a case," Mark said softly. "I just didn't know they'd move this fast." He walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight. He was still technically homeless. He still didn't have custody of his kids. But for the first time in months, the weight was gone. Elena wasn't beaming anymore. She wasn't acting like the winner. She was answering to a higher authority, and Mark knew the game had just changed completely. The battle for the divorce was over, the war for justice had just begun. The atmosphere in the courthouse hallway shifted from shock to chaos. As the military police led Elena away, her high-priced lawyer, Mr. Graves, was left standing alone with his briefcase. He looked like a man who had just realized the ship he was on was sinking. He turned to look at Mark, his face pale and sweaty. For the first time, the arrogant shark of a lawyer looked unsure of himself. Mark stood there, calm and collected. He adjusted his uniform cap, feeling a strange sense of quiet satisfaction. He didn't say a word to Graves. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said enough: "You picked the wrong side." Mark turned and walked out of the building, leaving the noise behind. He knew this wasn't the end, but the silence that followed the arrest was the most peaceful sound he had heard in months. He got into his car and drove back to base. He needed to prepare for the next round. The divorce hearing might have been interrupted, but it wasn't cancelled. The judge still had to decide on the future of their marriage, and now, the criminal charges would play a huge role in that decision. 2 weeks later, Mark returned to the courthouse. This time, the mood was completely different. Elena was present, but she wasn't holding her head high. She was sitting at her table, looking small and fragile. The flashy new clothes were gone, replaced by a modest, gray skirt and blouse. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her lawyer, Mr. Graves, was busy shuffling through a stack of papers, looking nervous. Every time the door opened, Elena jumped, terrified it was the police coming to drag her away again. Mark sat at his table with his JAG attorney. They had a thick folder of evidence in front of them, prepared by Mr. Henderson and the SID agents. It was a detailed account of every penny Elena had stolen, every lie she had told, and every scheme she had set up with Robert Vance. The judge entered the room and sat down. He looked over his glasses at both parties. "Let's proceed," he said. "I understand there are new developments regarding federal charges against Mrs. Mark." "Yes, Your Honor," Mark's lawyer spoke up. "We have submitted evidence that Mrs. Mark has committed significant financial fraud. This isn't just about an unhappy marriage. This is about a calculated plan to steal her husband's military benefits and use them for personal gain, all while he was serving overseas." The judge picked up the file. He spent a long time reading through it. The room was silent except for the sound of the turning pages. Mark watched the judge's face closely. At first, the judge looked bored, but as he read deeper, his eyebrows raised. He frowned. He shook his head slightly. It was clear that the irreconcilable differences story Elena had spun was falling apart. Finally, The judge closed the folder and looked at Elena. "Mrs. Mark," he said, his voice stern. "These documents show a clear pattern of deception and theft. You drained your husband's accounts while he was deployed. You used his housing allowance for personal luxuries. You involved a third party in a scheme to defraud the military." Elena started to cry. It wasn't the soft, pretty crying she did in the first hearing. It was ugly, sobbing crying. "I was lonely," she cried out. "He was never there. Robert, he made me feel special. He said we could invest the money and double it. I didn't mean to steal." "Silence," the judge banged his gavel. "This is not a soap opera. This is a court of law. You destroyed your family's financial stability. You risked your husband's career. And you did it all while he was defending this country." The judge turned his gaze to Mark. "Sergeant, it is clear to this court that you are the victim here. Mrs. Mark's claims of your instability were clearly a tactic to hide her own crimes. She tried to paint you as the villain so no one would look at what she was doing." Mark nodded, keeping his face neutral. Inside, he felt a wave of relief. He had been waiting months to hear someone in authority say those words. He wasn't the bad guy. He wasn't crazy. "Therefore," the judge continued, "I am granting the divorce immediately. All of Mrs. Mark's claims to your military pension are denied. She has no right to the retirement benefits you earned, especially given her criminal conduct. The house, which was purchased with military funds and VA loans, will be signed over entirely to you, Sergeant. Mrs. Mark will vacate the premises within 48 hours. Elena let out a loud wail, burying her face in her hands. Her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder, but he looked defeated. There was nothing he could say to fix this. "As for the children," the judge went on, his voice softening slightly. "Given the mother's involvement in criminal activity and her current unstable living situation, temporary full custody is awarded to Sergeant Mark. Mrs. Mark will have no visitation rights until she has been evaluated and cleared by a court-appointed psychologist. Furthermore, she is ordered to pay restitution for the funds she stole." Mark let out a long breath he felt like he'd been holding for 6 months. He had won. He had won the house, he had the kids, and he had cleared his name. He looked over at Elena one last time. She was shaking, her makeup running down her face. She looked like a stranger to him now. The woman he loved was gone, replaced by this greedy, desperate person sitting at the table. The judge stood up. "Case dismissed." The courtroom emptied quickly. Mark's lawyer shook his hand vigorously. "Great job, Sergeant. I rarely see a turnaround like this. She played a dangerous game and she lost." Mark thanked him and packed up his things. He walked out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon sun. It felt different than before. The sun didn't just feel warm, it felt like a new beginning. He wasn't going back to a motel. He was going back to his home to get his kids' rooms ready. He found Mr. Henderson waiting on a bench outside. The investigator stood up and grinned. "I heard the news," Henderson said. "Clean sweep. You got everything." "We got everything except for the truth about Robert," Mark said. "What happens to him?" "That's out of our hands now," Henderson said. "The CID is handling him. He's looking at a lot of time for fraud. He won't be bothering you or your family again." Mark nodded. He was glad. Vance was the mastermind behind this, the one who preyed on Elena's insecurity and greed. Mark hoped they locked him up and threw away the key. Mark drove to the school to pick up Lily and Noah. It was their first day coming home with him as their full-time guardian. He parked the car and waited near the gate. When the bell rang, he saw them come out. They looked a little confused, maybe because their mother wasn't there, but as soon as they spotted Mark, their faces lit up. "Daddy!" Lily screamed, running toward him. Noah followed close behind, dropping his backpack to give Mark a hug. Mark scooped them both up, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders that he didn't even know was there. "Hey guys," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Guess what, you're coming home with me today. You're going to stay with me for a long time." "Are we going to see Mommy?" Noah asked. Mark looked down at his son, carefully choosing his words. "Mommy has some grown-up problems she has to fix right now. She needs some time alone. But you have me. And I promise I'm never going anywhere again." They got into the car and drove to the house. When they pulled into the driveway, the shiny new SUV was gone. Good, Mark thought. Her lawyer had probably arranged to get it out of there before the deadline. The house looked quiet and welcoming. They walked inside. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in weeks, but to Mark, it smelled like home. He took the kids to the kitchen and made them a snack, something simple like peanut butter and crackers. He watched them eat and laugh, arguing over who got the bigger cup of juice. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Over the next few days, Mark worked hard to make the house feel like a home again. He changed the locks, just to be safe. He moved Elena's things out of the master bedroom and boxed them up to put in the garage. He didn't throw them away, he wasn't that petty. He just wanted them gone from his sight. He started to settle into a routine. Mornings were for getting the kids ready for school. Days were for his military duties and meetings with the prosecutors to build the case against Elena. Evenings were for homework, dinner, and bedtime stories. It was exhausting work, being a single dad, but it was fulfilling. He felt useful again. He felt like a father, but even as Mark found his peace, he knew Elena wasn't finished. She was spiraling out of control, and he knew from experience that a trapped animal is the most dangerous kind. She had lost the house, the money, and the kids. She was facing criminal charges. She had nothing left to lose. Mark's phone rang late one night. It was Mr. Henderson. "Mark," the investigator said, his voice serious. "I'm calling to warn you. My sources tell me Elena isn't taking this well. She's telling people that you set her up. She's claiming you framed her to get custody. She's desperate." "Let her talk," Mark said. "The evidence is all there. She can talk her way into a prison cell." "Just be careful," Henderson warned. "Desperate people do stupid things. Watch the kids. Watch your back." Mark hung up the phone and looked out the window at the dark street. He saw a car drive slowly past his house, then speed up when it reached the corner. It was probably nothing, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He walked through the house, checking every door and window to make sure they were locked. He stood in the hallway, listening to the sound of his children breathing as they slept. He thought about the conversation he had with his commander that afternoon. The commander had told him that the military was pushing for the maximum penalty for Elena. They wanted to make an example of her to stop other spouses from trying the same thing. The commander had also told Mark that the appointment for the final military tribunal had been set. It was going to happen in 2 weeks. Mark knew that the divorce victory was just the first half of the battle. The civil court had given him his life back. The criminal court was about to take Elena's away. And Mark knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that when that appointment came, Elena would finally understand the true cost of her betrayal. She thought the divorce was the worst thing that could happen. She was wrong. The real judgment was still to come. Mark went to bed, but he didn't sleep well. He dreamed of courtroom doors and cold handcuffs. He dreamed of Elena's face, twisted in anger. When he woke up, the sun was rising, and he realized that the calm he felt wasn't the end of the storm. It was just the eye of the hurricane. The hardest part was yet to come, and for the first time, he felt a pang of pity for the woman he used to love. She had no idea what was coming.